All right, let's get started. Thank you for joining us today for our webcast on how to know if your development initiatives are working. My name is Brianna Harper, and I'm your webinar host. I'm also your resource for any questions you have about today's topic. I'll be taking questions throughout the presentation, so feel free to chat in whenever something comes to mind. You'll also see a follow-up email from me after the presentation with today's slide deck and a link to the recording. If you have any questions after the presentation, please reach out. You can email me at bharper@outmatch.com or find me on social @OutmatchHCM. This is the second in our three-part People Analytics series designed to help you become an expert in measuring the success of your initiatives, from hiring and development to investing in HR tech. If you joined us for part one, welcome back. If you missed part one, don't worry. In part two of our series, we're shifting gears from talent acquisition to talent management and learning and development. Today's presentation will explore the post-hire side of People Analytics. But if you're curious about the hiring metrics we covered in People Analytics 101, you can find it on demand at outmatch.com/webinars or on our YouTube page. Today's presentation is valid for one professional development credit for the SHRM CP or SHRM SCP. Please email me after the presentation for the activity ID. As a thank you for attending today, you'll get a free copy of How to Unlock Learning Agility to Boost Leadership Performance, which was written by one of our presenters today. In this ebook, you'll find strategies for identifying learning agility among current and future leaders, plus tips on creating a learning agile culture. This will also be included in my follow-up email. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. Nikki Herrmann is the Manager of Services Design and Development at Outmatch. She has worked with some of our biggest clients to help build their leadership bench strength and develop and retain their team members. Christina Sherrod is the President of People Strategy Group, a learning solutions firm located here in Dallas that is dedicated to helping companies succeed by improving the effectiveness of their leaders and teams. She works with organizations of all sizes to solve their challenges around key talent development and selection. Nikki and Christina, thanks for being with us today. I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Brianna.
Great, thanks, Brianna. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Nikki Herrmann, and I just want to echo Brianna's welcome. We are super excited to have you all here today, and I personally am really excited to have Christina here. Christina and I have actually worked together quite a bit on development-related initiatives with our clients, and so we're really passionate about this work, and we're really excited to share some of the insights that we've taken away from our clients. So the topic is around how to know if your development initiatives are working. And that's the question, right? As L&D professionals, we all want to know that. And organizations are spending more money today than they ever have on these types of initiatives. And Christina will talk a little bit more about that. So it's important to be able to really demonstrate impact. But to do that, you first have to make sure your programs are impactful. And so today we're going to start there. That's really the foundation for demonstrating success. So we've broken the agenda today into those two sections. We're definitely going to leave some time for questions, so feel free to chat those into Brianna along the way. But again, really appreciate you all being here today. So with that being said, I just want to emphasize how big of a challenge this is. You are not alone. 70% of L&D teams report feeling pressure from leadership to measure learning's impact. And we know that that is happening. I see it every single day with the clients that I work with. Christina, why do you think that that's happening?
Well, first, let me just say I am so happy to be back and to be connecting and working with you guys on this webinar today. So thank you for that. But to your point, Nikki, I can absolutely see it. And I see it in my clients every day. And for a couple of reasons. First, as you mentioned, organizational investments in learning and development have been increasing year over year for a number of years. And now, I mean, depending on the survey that you look at and whether they're taking training plus leadership development into account, and the estimates are well above $50 billion. I mean, it's a huge, huge investment. And it makes sense that the organization is saying, what are we seeing in return for this investment? What needles of the organization are moving, even if you are seeing individual growth and development? But additionally, a layer on top of that is organizations are becoming more agile. It's a way of operating, no longer just a methodology, right? And as they do that, the expectation that L&D departments and the people that they work with are also embracing that philosophy is growing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think one other, thing that I'm seeing with clients too is just the access to data, right? Everything we do needs to be data driven. And this is one of those areas that we don't always have the clear metrics that we need. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that and some ways to potentially overcome some of these challenges. But first, let's start out with the poll.
Yes, absolutely. So before we dive in, we want to hear from all of you in our audience today. So take a moment, if you would, to just indicate your agreement with this statement. Our talent development strategy is strongly aligned to the business goals. And you have some options there, so take a moment. We'll let a few of these populate. And don't worry, please be honest. We promise the results are aggregated. No one can see your individual selection. But we're excited to kind of get a sense of where the audience is today on this key imperative.
All right, so we'll give everybody just another minute here.
We're seeing the results trickle in. So thank you to those of you who have contributed. Let's pull them up on the screen now.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, so it looks like the majority of you fall somewhere in more of the neutral or agree phase, with 18% actually saying disagree. So let's see how that compares to some of the research that we're seeing. So according to the Brandon Hall Group in a study they've recently done, about 38% of organizations say their learning strategy is effectively aligned to business goals.
I think that's the key, Nikki.
Yeah,
effectively.
Absolutely, right? And so as Christina and I were talking about this, I think as L&D professionals, we assume, of course, it's aligned to the business. That's what we do. But sometimes the business has a very different perspective, right? And so the key is to doing this really effectively and being able to demonstrate that.
Mm-hmm.
So Christina, why do you think there's this disconnect that can occur?
Well, I think it's twofold. I think there are a set of obvious reasons, like we're operating on limited time schedules with limited resources, running very lean groups or departments, or leveraging external consultants that we may not plug in. But the more complex, subtle, long-term reasons, I think, are that organizations are operating at a really fast clip these days. And so the business strategy is no longer a 3 to 5 year plan. Right? Mm-hmm. It's a yearly effort. We're expecting that continuous movement. So the target is often shifting.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And another piece of that is that, as you mentioned, development initiatives are more and more focusing on soft skills, and those are tough to measure. And if the organization doesn't have a lot of metrics in place, that adds another layer of difficulty to this.
Absolutely.
So it's easier said than done, Nikki.
Absolutely. So I guess, where do you get started? How do you really align to the business goals?
That's a great question. So let's take a look at some recommendations, and we'll dig into each of these. First, I think first and foremost, increasing the business acumen and exposure of your L&D team, and even if you're leveraging external folks, to what's happening in your business, to your industry, to how your business makes money, that they fully understand that. And there's a number of ways I think you can do this, but one of the ways we talked about was, ensuring that they can do certain things like naming competitors, understanding the organization's competitive advantage, being able to identify the risks, the market risks that the organization faces. If they're going to be true business partners, they need to be able to talk the language of the business. Another piece of that is ensuring that there is a true partnership to really identify those key needs. This is something where we see a lot of assumptions made that this is good, therefore it must be good for our business, versus are we tackling business challenges that are really critical to the business making money and being profitable. And so engaging your key business partners as true partners, not just stakeholders,
Absolutely.
I think is part of the key. And Nikki, have you seen this done really well?
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, it all comes down to building that relationship with the business, right? And so I actually work with a pretty large telecom client, and she shared with me one of her techniques in being new to that industry and how she does this. But when she meets with operation leaders, she always asks them, what is keeping you up at night? And I love that because it's such it's a great conversation starter to begin with, but it also starts to show you what the most pressing needs across the business truly are. So I love that example. And I agree, you know, I think it really comes down to being credible, demonstrating that credibility with your business partners, and continuing to build that over time.
I like the curious nature of that. I think being authentically curious and tapping into that absolutely leads to some great conversations that allow you to have a real strategic insight once you connect the dots.
Yep.
So the third point here is considering the largest impact points. And what we mean by that is, you know, I think traditionally organizational investment on training and development initiatives seem to really focus on higher level leaders. I mean, the greatest investment being at the highest level. And partially that's because some of the interventions there are very expensive. However, more and more we're seeing that trickle down through the business and be more strategic in the selection of those impact points. One example of this is I recently worked with a fast casual restaurant brand that just had an amazing visibility into the fact that their general managers were a mission critical role for them. And that's where they felt like some things were breaking down or having a true impact on their engagement of their talent in the stores, their turnover, as well as their customer service engagement, their customer service feedback scores. And so they took some real intentional efforts to apply focus there, building a high potential program, ensuring they have some key focus areas that were targeted on their challenges that made a big difference.
Yeah, I love that.
Nikki, have I think you mentioned some examples.
Yeah, I mean,
well.
very similar example. We're big in the hospitality industry, and so we work with a lot of restaurant and hotel clients, and we have seen this shift in how these companies are distributing their budget. And so one of the hotel clients that I work with specifically has really transformed the way they even think about that population, and really have started to use data, and that's where our partnership has really come in, is using data to understand that population today. So what are their gaps? What are their strengths? Potentially, where should you move them around in terms of the best fit around location? And so they've really strategically used that data and that information and partnered with the business to make better decisions. And so we've seen some really strong results with that. It's translated to higher NPS scores, higher performance ratings, higher engagement. And so this is definitely something we see when we're working with our clients today.
Super. Great example.
All right, so once you've partnered with a business, you really have an understanding of some of those potential opportunities. It's very tempting to think you have the right solution, right? Christina used the phrase yesterday, let me make sure I get this right, when you have a hammer, everything is a nail. And I had thought Christina actually made this, actually made this up. I'm like, that is brilliant. So I Googled it, and sure enough, it was not Christina, it was Maslow.
I can't take credit for that one, sorry, Nikki.
But either way, I'm very impressed with it. I'd never heard it before. And I think it's so true, right? As learning and development professionals and human beings, we are absolutely prone to this. I've seen examples of this where, for instance, you're partnering with a business and you hear, we need to be the first to market with a great new product. And so you think, okay, we need to increase innovation. So let's do this great innovation workshop, right? That all sounds logical. But maybe your people are already innovative. Maybe there's something else going on, right? Where you have a culture that doesn't encourage risk taking. And so that may be your target intervention. And so it's really important to first take a step back and assess current gaps today. And so there are a number of different ways that you can do that. There are competency-based assessments that may look at actual kind of skill level and competence in these areas, as well as personality. That's a very big driving factor that you might want to consider. There are other things like simulations that we see our clients use to understand where people are at today and what gaps exist, as well as 360 tools and manager interviews. So there are a number of different tools and technology that you can leverage to help facilitate that process. But it's really about benchmarking where you're at today.
And Nikki, I think you talked about sort of that quantitative approach, and I think there's the qualitative approach as well. So just the focus groups, the kind of getting under the hood before you jump in. And sometimes you feel a pressure to take action quickly, but a lot of what we're going to talk about today focuses on the proactive behaviors.
Absolutely. So once you've kind of went through that process of identifying potential gaps, you want to be very clear about what problem you are actually trying to solve, and even more importantly, what are the behaviors you're trying to change? So what are the actual behaviors that you have to shift to solve that problem? So that's really, really important to go through that process and make sure your stakeholders are very aligned with that. I think Christina will share some examples too about where this can go wrong, but that is absolutely key in understanding the direction that you want to move and making sure that you are targeting the right intervention. All right, and then finally, consider context, right? So there are a number of different things that might influence whether or not your particular intervention is going to make an impact. And so you're really going to want to spend a little bit of time thinking about things that could impede or get in the way, such as participant time and availability. That's a key one. Also, what is going on in the organization? If you're launching a ton of different initiatives or surveys, it might not be the right time. As Christina said, we're so quick to jump into action that sometimes we lose sight of some of the other things that might be going on. Is there strong engagement and trust, right? So a lot of the cultural elements you need to consider when you're thinking about the right intervention. And finally, do you have executive support? This is a big one, right? And so this is where involving your stakeholders can really help drive this, but you want to ensure that when you identify the right intervention, that you have the support that you need from leadership and that they're publicly supportive of this process.
Completely agree. Completely agree. So an important question to ask here is, once you've identified what the needs are, you've really articulated what are the behaviors that need to move. So you've applied behavioral science to what you know about the business, right? Then what does success of this initiative look like to your stakeholders? So consider that in most cases, you're going to have multiple stakeholders. We may be aligned mostly with one or working most closely with one business leader, but in most cases that I've experienced, I've had multiple stakeholders. And when we're encountering this, we want to really understand for each individual, what are their perspectives? What are their objectives for the business? What are they personally accountable for? Because those are the things that are going to drive their perception of success. And what's meaningful to them. So as we're unpacking this, we started with the layer of the organization. Now we're looking at the layer of the stakeholder, and then in a minute we'll talk about the participant. But consider that, let me give you an example of this. Consider that if you're doing an online customer engagement training program, maybe for a group of frontline leaders, then the executive leader of that business unit may be really focused on moving the needle on their customer feedback surveys. They want that data to be positive. They really care about that customer experience, and that's a number that they are personally accountable for. However, the manager of that unit, who's doing a lot of direct work with that frontline leader group, may actually want the team members to feel more prepared with handling challenging customer questions so that they're not escalating them all the time and detracting from the productivity of the unit and also morale. They want them to be prepared so they don't get kind of beat down by it. You know, we've seen this before. So you have multiple stakeholders, and taking that into account as you're defining your outcomes and moving towards what metrics are you going to use. With that in mind, setting reasonable expectations. So if you can't deliver on one of those things, be open about it, be explicit. What are the needles you are committing to trying to move? What does that look like? And then also engaging the learners. So often, I think, Nikki, you know, you may have seen this, but we launch initiatives and we move forward with programs, and it feels very behind the curtain that the participant is experiencing it, but they're not a partner in it. And I think these work best, in my experience, when we have been extremely explicit that, hey, we're all in this together. This is the needle we're trying to move. These are the outcomes that we care about. You are critical to this business. You are so important. Help us help you. So I think that tends to give them a level of accountability and partnership that increases the likelihood of that impact.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I've seen this done really well. And you know, we work with a really large hospitality organization, and they did a great job of, they kind of went through this process of doing an alpha and beta of the program and had a representative group of the target population, and they really helped shape what that program looked like, right? So we went in with an idea of what we wanted it to be, but they knew the outcomes that we were trying to drive, and they gave us some great feedback, and there were a lot of adjustments that were made along the way. So I love the idea of really engaging your learners as part of that design phase.
I think that's so valuable. And then from a change management perspective, those become some of your early adopters and influencers who support the program from within. I think that's great.
Absolutely. So we've talked a lot about increasing the impact of your program. Very important stuff. We want to shift gears a little bit now and talk about measurement. So before we dive in, we want to hear from you all again. So take a moment and go ahead and respond to the poll you should see here shortly. But what challenges are you facing, or what is a primary challenge that you are facing related to measuring development impact? And feel free, if you don't see your response here, feel free to chat that in, or any additional thoughts or comments that you have directly to Brianna. So we'll give you guys just a moment here.
These are great options. Knowing what to measure, ability or access to data. Some of these we've talked about, but some not so much. Applying the information you collect.
All right. Brianna, do you want to go ahead and close the poll?
That's great. So if you look, so we see a distribution here, not so much with communicating to stakeholders. It sounds like, at least in this audience, people are pretty comfortable with that, but knowing what to measure and the getting started piece. So hopefully some of the maximizing impact tips gave you some help there. But as we switch over into this discussion about really being intentional and proactive in your measurement strategy, I think part of it is that these challenges are going to exist. You know, we're going to be dealing with softer skills, individuals who may be a little away from the data, but we are going to keep working towards demonstrating impact every time.
Absolutely. So before we dive into some of the key metrics and measurement strategies, we want to just kind of level set. Back to Christina's point, it's all about being intentional and proactive in your measurement strategy. So a couple kind of key things I would keep in mind here. So first, you know, you're going to want to start with some type of measurement framework, right? And there are a number of them that exist. There, you do a quick Google search and you're going to find a lot of them. Kirkpatrick is the one that probably most of you are familiar with, and it's been around for a while, but it is very foundational, and I think the framework and really thinking through each of those levels can help you in terms of painting the full picture of impact. So Christina and I are going to walk through that and share some kind of examples of how you do that really effectively. But we would recommend kind of exploring some of the frameworks that exist and figuring out, based on the initiative, based on your organization, which makes the most sense to follow. So another thing to keep in mind as you think about your overall measurement strategy is the degrees of separation. So we're not talking about Kevin Bacon here, but really how far are your target participants from each of these data points? And so as we talk through each of these levels, you're going to see that it increases, right? And so there are other factors that might come into play, and that's fine. But really it's about showing that you're moving the right needles and really painting that full picture of impact.
Yeah, I think it's okay if it is correlational and
Right.
not causal. We're only going to be able to be so statistically perfect here.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, that's something that oftentimes is the reason why we throw our hands up and say we can't do this, right? Because we know there are other factors, but that shouldn't stop us from showing that there is an impact. So the last kind of point here before we dive into the measurement strategy is just, again, ensuring that you have stakeholder confidence and participation in the measurement approach. So this is a key one. Christina, do you have any examples about maybe how this has gone really well or not so well?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I probably have more about how it
Right.
has gone not well, but which is why it's in this presentation. But I mean, in reality, this is, again, why the partnership is so important up front. And sometimes presumptively, we think that if there are metrics being gathered in the business, they must be viewed as credible and positive and taken at face value. And unfortunately, I have been in the situation where we have moved forward, done extensive analysis, kind of pre-post analysis, looking at impact of results, only to sit around an executive table and hear, yeah, I don't know about that data. You know, it has the X, Y, and Z challenge to it. You know, whether it's supervisor ratings of supervisors that weren't deemed credible, or whether it is turnover data that the voluntary and involuntary reasons were very mishmashed and not applied consistently, whether, you know, it's quality data that, you know, they know only happened for part of the year and not the whole year. I mean, just a myriad of things. So before you go any further, ensure that the metrics that you select are viewed as credible by your key stakeholders, and that you've kind of ferreted out any of those challenges on the front end.
Yeah, I'm shaking my head because I have been there, and I'm sure everybody on the line has. So I think that is absolutely a key point.
So as you're thinking about this, so Nikki mentioned the Kirkpatrick model. So this is probably what most of us are familiar with when we think about evaluating the effectiveness of training and learning initiatives in general. But I do encourage you, think about first, you know, what data do you have available as you're looking at these different levels? You know, the first being kind of reaction. These are what we call, you know, smile sheets in our industry. Did people find it engaging? Did they perceive that they learned something? Did they feel like it was a valuable use of their time? You move up into more of the learning. So was there new knowledge acquired, which again is a self-perception. Then is there actual behavior change as a result, which is level 3. And then once you get up to the highest level, that's more, are we seeing movements in metrics? Are actual metrics moving? And you know, as you're looking at this, it can be a little bit overwhelming, but you think about, okay, what does your outcome variable lend itself to? So when you were thinking before about, you know, what was important to our business and what's important to your stakeholders, is there an actual result for that? What makes the most sense? It may be more behavioral rather than results. And then are there indirect metrics that can be valuable here as well? So when we think about these levels, you know, initially, level 1 and level 2 are kind of easy to discount. But Nikki, do you have a few kind of tips or thoughts that we should keep in mind about those? It's kind of easy to say, oh, I don't know how valuable that is.
Yeah, I mean, you see the stats here on the screen, right? So most people do it, right? But most people don't actually think it's valuable. So the question is, should we stop measuring level 1 reactions? And I would say no, right? Because there absolutely are reasons why we should continue doing that, and there are ways to do it even more effectively. So I always recommend keeping an eye on survey design. So to me, the core of the survey and all of the questions that are built into these surveys have to be actionable. So as you're designing the survey, I would think about what can you do based on their response. If there is nothing you can do based on that response, don't ask it. And so this sounds very basic, but you would be surprised when you go through this process how many questions you will probably eliminate or change. And, you know, I think I saw a client that they originally had asked on their evaluation whether or not people were satisfied with the training room. And this is a smaller company. They have one training room. They do not have budget for another training room. They know it's not perfect. And so they knew exactly what they were going to see. So a better question would be, are they okay going through this training in smaller, maybe more intimate groups? So typically they had full departments going through. And once they started to ask that, they realized, oh, we could actually break this down and we could make it more comfortable for people. And there are other benefits of having smaller groups. So really making sure that you're asking actionable questions is key here. I think, you know, another key thing to think about is then how do you use this data and how do you analyze the data? So we always recommend, of course, giving participants the option to respond anonymously. You're hopefully going to get a better variation in responses versus the just super happy engaged people. But then it does come down to kind of how you leverage this information and how you identify trends. So check the reliability of the data, look at consistency. If there's any way to kind of categorize different groups, so at least if you're not asking their name, maybe find out the department that they're in, if that's possible. But then start to see, are there different responses from different departments potentially, or even levels? That's something we see happen quite a bit where, you know, based on your level, you may have a very, very different experience. And that's important to know. You might not be targeting the right content for that specific level.
I was just going to chime in really quickly. I think this is such a valuable dialogue, Nikki, because I see and I have experienced we get so wed to the solutions that we have in place. We can become very attached to them. You put in so much time and so much effort. And if you're really looking at measuring impact and thinking about this honestly, you have to be willing to get results that suggest you need to do something differently.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, that is a key point across the board when it comes to your full measurement strategy, right? Your goal is not necessarily, I know we said in the title, how to prove they're working, but it's really around using data to figure out the impact that you're having today, and then how might you adjust that to make it even more impactful. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And so I think my opinion is, yes, level 1 is really important. And, you know, sometimes it actually addresses a gap that could be occurring in level 2. So if learning isn't happening or they're not able to take it back to their jobs, why might that be happening? And oftentimes you find that answer within your level 1 data.
So that's really, I think, a great overview of how to make the most of what we absolutely know, bare minimum, you have available to you. So as we get into a deeper look, so let's talk about behavior change. When you're thinking about this, you know, we know that the path to impact and ROI really often happen with level 3 and 4 data. That's where we're going to quantify movement. The behavior change, for example, if new information was learned, what was the actual change that was taken back and occurred? You know, so many times people participate in these great initiatives, but what needle moves? So one consideration is that it can take time and may require an additional investment in and of itself. And the investment of time it's no joke. I mean, if we look at what it takes to put measurement in place and go back and pick it up at a later date and then to analyze data, this becomes part of the cost of the program in actuality. I mean, have you seen that, Nikki, as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've started to see when they're budgeting a program, if this is very key to their stakeholders,
Yes,
there needs to be a line for that.
yes. And so to that vein, we have begun, and obviously we've been sort of in the technology business, but leveraging technology for this purpose, because that's how we're going to be able to see, in many cases, facilitating the data collection and analysis, unless there are mechanisms already internally in place. So the ROI of the training and learning initiative has to take that piece into account as well. So in the technologies, it can be things like, generally relying on perceptions of behavior change, perceptions of feedback. And that may be self-report, but it also, in most cases, is manager data or team data or peer data. So it could be a 360. And in our case, we've used before a mini 360 or feedback tool, or a feedback tool that really is going to look at some of those movements on competency-based behaviors. So since the behavior data can be subject to bias, keep in mind the possibility of a halo effect, and really ensure that those targets link back to your initial outcome data. That they're linked back to the specific behaviors we were talking about before, and that they're very specific. So, take for example the example of influences others. If you're asking for perceptions on if level of influence has increased, we want to be as operationalized and specific as possible. So things like speaks with passion and energy. Something that's observable to other people. If it's an internal experience, the ratings will invariably wash away. So we're going to take a quick look at a few of the technologies that we've used. So this is actually an Outmatch product. Assess 360 gives a focus 360, which allows us to take kind of a mini zoom in. And this presumed we did a full 360 at the beginning of the initiative, which in this case we did, and we looked at movement over time. So following the development program, we came back in with this focused 360 and looked at the behaviors that were really core and critical to this unit's business. And we were able to get a second behavior rating, so we can look at time 1 versus time 2, but also a perception of observed change, and keep in mind, in some cases, it could get worse. And then the ability to kind of pull that apart and look at that across some different behaviors is very helpful. In addition to that, we've got an example here from our partners at DevelopMe, which is a very cool tool that we're really excited to kind of showcase here, but gives you some good data in terms of being able to take a look at feedback on very specific competencies. Now, this is different. This is intended to be used as kind of a continual feedback mechanism. And DevelopMe has an app or a web-enabled operation that gives the chance for a participant to solicit feedback or receive unsolicited feedback, depending on how the settings are provided, on specific behaviors and competencies. And so let me give you an example. If I have a meeting with Nikki and Brianna here, or after the webinar, I could send them a request for feedback and allow them to give me some specific feedback around my performance in that meeting, and then I would be able to track that over time. So the real-time nature of it gives it a much different level of responsiveness and an appeal than a traditional 360. And we're seeing a lot of movement towards tools like this in order to be much more real-time.
Absolutely.
Another look here at some of the data from DevelopMe, and this is sample data. gives us a perspective on average improvement over time. So there's an individual experience. We're supporting the changes that we're seeing in the development initiative. So it is in and of itself becoming a tool for development. However, we're able to track movement, and that visibility is very rare.
Great. Yeah. And to Christina's point, we are certainly seeing this shift in terms of using continuous feedback and being able to look at impact on demand and over time versus leveraging a 360 that shows you kind of at one point in time. But there are absolutely benefits in cases where a 360 might be more appropriate. Okay, so we've talked a lot, you've seen a lot of great examples about measuring some of that individual level behavior change. And so now we're at kind of the grand finale, right? the one that we're all aiming for, which oftentimes is referred to as level 4. Some models say there's actually a level 5, and that's ROI. But we're gonna kind of bucket that into level 4 and really think about this as demonstrating business impact. And so this is, again, the goal that we're all attaining to get to. But I do, before we kind of jump into an example of this and one of our clients that we've worked with to do this, I want to level set and just remind you on a few key things here. So to start out, we did look at some of the data out there and found that about 35% of talent development professionals report that their organizations are evaluating business results of any kind. So that's a pretty small number, right? And then 15% are measuring ROI. But we learned at the beginning of this session that 70% of us feel pressure to do this exactly. We live and work in an environment where we are data driven and we need numbers. And so we're going to talk about how you can get there. It may not be perfect, it might be a little bit messy, but there are ways to overcome some of the challenges that we've talked about over the course of the session today. So in terms of the challenges, I'll reiterate a couple of them. One of the big things that we hear is, of course, access to data. So the key there is understanding what data you have available. So using the data that you have. To Christina's point, making sure you're confident in that data. So that starts with partnering with the business, and the data that you're using should be tied to those outcomes, right? That's incredibly key here. So make sure it's aligned with the business, make sure it's aligned with those outcomes. The next common issue that we oftentimes hear is just the lack of resources, time, as well as the skill set to be able to do something like this. And so keep in mind the degrees of separation conversation that we had. As you move farther away from some of these individual metrics and are thinking about broader business metrics, there are other influencing factors. And so you really need to weigh the cost against the benefits of doing that type of an analysis. And another way to look at it is weighing cost against precision. And so, sure, you know, there are certainly ways to statistically determine which factors are really driving impact, but we all probably don't have the resources to do that for every single program that we're delivering. And so it's really important to kind of go through this analysis of weighing the cost against the benefits, and then thinking about, you know, what level of precision is really necessary based on the investment that you're making. The third thing here, I think we've alluded to this along the way, your goal should be to not prove, but aim for impact instead of proof. And so again, you know, the key here is really painting the picture in terms of the full impact versus focusing solely on ROI. That should be one piece of the puzzle. So let's take a look at a quick case study and then we'll transition into questions. And so I wanted to share with you all some of the ways that one of our clients has demonstrated impact. And so this is one of our restaurant clients, and their goal, they came to us and said, hey, we've worked with the business and they want to increase our server sales. Help us figure out a way to do that. And so our first step was, let's not assume what intervention is needed. And so we really worked with them to understand, where might this be coming from, right? And so we talked about managers and the impact that managers have on their teams. And so we started with looking at the manager population to understand, where might there be a skill gap that's contributing to server sales. And what we found is that managers that were rated more strongly on their ability to coach in the moment from their team members tended to have stronger server sales. And so that is the intervention that we really targeted, was training managers. How do you coach in the moment? And we talked to managers that do this really effectively and built a program around that. So after we implemented this program, we waited, I would say, about 6 months for a significant number of individuals to go through the program and then have some time to actually demonstrate those behaviors. And because we had a baseline measurement of their skills and gaps today, we were able to look at improvement. And so we saw an increase in the perceived behavior change, which was great. So we thought, good, it's working, right? But they didn't want us to stop there. And so the next step for us was really to understand that business impact. And so we worked with the team and the business to gather those operational metrics. And we did this as part of the design, right? We knew that was the key outcome they were trying to drive. And so what we found in doing that analysis is that server sales actually increased by about $71 per month per person, based on the actual people that are going through the program. So that, $71, that may not seem like a huge number, but that really translates to a big number when you think about all of the individuals that are going through this program. At some point, they wanted every single manager and all of the team members that they had. And so that sounded great to them, but they said, want more. We really want to show what the true ROI of this program is. And so our next step was to calculate the ROI. And so where we started is by first understanding what is the benefit. So what is the average benefit in terms of dollars? And we did this by taking that $71 figure that we identified, and we applied that by 6 months. So because this was kind of a 6-month initiative, we wanted to take a similar time frame and say, okay, over the course of 6 months, and we had that data, 6 months of data, what does that number then look like? We then took the average number of servers per manager to get this overall benefit figure per participant, which was $5,112. So that was fantastic. We were super excited to see that, but we have to weigh in the cost, right? There is absolutely a cost in these types of programs and initiatives. And so the cost, there are a number of different factors you have to consider: the time, the actual materials, any technology that you might be leveraging, but we figured out that the cost per participant was about $1,900. And so the next step, once we had those two key figures, was to measure the ROI. And so you see the calculation that we use here. And what we found in doing this was the ROI was actually 168%. And so you see that number on the top there. So that was great. And that really helped our champions demonstrate to their operational leaders the importance of this work and why it matters. And so it was a very successful program. But as you can see, there certainly are steps that you can take to get there, to show these figures. But it is an art and a science. And that's the key to remember, right? Is you don't want to just throw your hands up and say, oh, because we don't have the data, we can't demonstrate impact. There are different ways to do that. It's really about what data you can use and have available, and then how you paint the picture for them.
And Nikki, I love that example. I think it's so detailed and so helpful. But even when the participant doesn't have such a clear linkage to the dollar value, right? So in that example, it was really kind of nicely laid out. But in some cases, it's a tougher connection.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we've done is we've engaged operators and had them estimate value of every uptick in the metric that we're looking at. So while that's imperfect in many ways, it's an approximation, and it allows you to speak in the language of the business.
Absolutely. So before, we're going to wrap up pretty quick here, but just wanted to share, we talked about the importance of visualizing the data. So Christina has some great examples that we'll just walk through very briefly here.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about using the data to tell a story, we want to come back to, and you may have heard this in actually some of the other analytics webinars that you've been attending with Outmatch, but rather than presenting graphs and charts and numbers, what we aim to do is really tell a story of success, a story of the business. And remember, this is where we're linking it back into the language of our stakeholders and making it matter to them. So let's just take a quick look at a few visuals. First example that we want to show you is this kind of team impact map. So an opportunity to map across the business the impact of a specific team. And we've got kind of placeholders here for the team so you can make it really visual, but then looking at multiple metrics when you have a chance to. And you can see on this impact map, what we've done is at the top, you really have a layout of your interventions over time, remembering that when we're looking at team data or organizational data, and when we're multiple layers of separation away, as Nikki talked about before, it's going to take time to see the impact. They won't happen right away. It'll be over a series of time. And then another great one, again from the Develop Me analytic platform, is the opportunity to really look at some indirect data. So in this case, the connections that are happening across the business. So you get a chance to see here who's connecting with who. Are there gaps? Are there departments that are isolated and siloed? You can visualize silos and really take some steps to overcome them. So going that extra mile, if you will, making the data tell a story.
Great. Well, that is everything we had prepared. I know we've got a little bit of time here. Brianna, did we have any questions come in?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nikki and Christina. That was a great presentation. This is actually my favorite part of the presentation, where we take questions from all of you on the call. I have a few things coming in, so please get in your questions. Before we dive in, I want to do a quick plug for Outmatch. You know, Nikki and Christina talked a lot about working closely with clients on their development initiatives, but I also wanted to let you all know that inside our assessment software, we're actually creating really scalable ways to support development. So we're making it really easy to assess your employees. So it's not just a pre-employment assessment. You can assess your employees and then really support them with development content after you see those results, and you'll be able to track some of the behaviors and measure some of the behaviors that Nikki and Christina talked about today. So I wanted to get that in before we roll on. Okay, so I've got some really good things here. Earlier in the poll, John chatted in the poll about challenges, and he said measuring soft skills for employees with diverse experience levels. And I think you mentioned this, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that from like a diversity perspective.
Yeah, so let me take a look at this. Where is we? So measuring soft skills. So, you know, I think if that is kind of a key challenge, I guess in my experience, you absolutely want to encourage diversity and look at diversity and the impact that might be having, right, on those soft skills. But Christina, is there anything that you have seen in terms of that being a specific challenge for organizations?
You know, and I want to make sure I'm capturing the question correctly. But if I think about different experience levels, because I believe that was the key here. When you have a different level of experience, it's going to be expressed differently. Mm-hmm. And so the key, in my sense, in that way, is to operationalize what that soft skill looks like at each different level and not apply a uniform mm-hmm. value or a uniform definition to each. So that's kind of my take on it.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to another question. This is from Kendall. How do we measure impact at a nonprofit?
That is tough. What great questions. You guys are giving us a run for our money here. I think a nonprofit is a special case in the sense that you may or may not have some of the additional investments in metrics already put in place because there's not the focus on profitability. But because you're a nonprofit, the expectation of protecting the investment that you do make is even more important. And so I think, again, that's going to vary a little bit based on what data you have available. And it may be that you're able to leverage some of the level 3 data more effectively.
Thank you so much. We've got a couple questions coming in, but I do want to close out our presentation before we run out of time. So I will reach out to anyone we didn't have a chance to answer, and we will get everything answered for you.
Well, thank you for those wonderful questions. We are so appreciative. If there's any other questions that you have relative to talent development or some of these ways that you can really make the most of it, please feel free, if I can get my words out, feel free to reach out to me at Christina@peoplestrategygroup.com, as well as I think Brianna shared her contact information at the top of the hour.
Yeah, you can absolutely contact Outmatch, and we partner with Christina, so we can absolutely help you as well. And if you're interested more in the Develop Me tool, they are one of our partners, so feel free to reach out to us, and we can certainly put you in touch with them as well.
Absolutely, thank you. So we hope to see everyone again next month for part 3 in our People Analytics series, where you'll get an under the hood look at the AI that's driving the HR tech industry. In People Analytics 301, IO psychologist and machine learning expert Keith McCook will arm you with top considerations and questions you need to make great HR tech investments. Don't miss it, August 21st. If you attend, you'll receive another professional development credit from the SHRM CP or SHRM SCP. If you'd like to go back and watch People Analytics 101, you can find it in all of our past webinars at outmatch.com/webinars or on our YouTube page. I'll also include a link in my follow-up email along with the activity ID for your SHRM Professional Development credit. I hope you all enjoyed today's presentation. Feel free to reach out to me with questions or feedback at bharper@outmatch.com. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you end it from your end?
I don't think I can.